When the Golem made contact with the entire planet as a whole, there was some apprehension for sure. Most everybody thought it was some sort of internet prank, some sort of cyber attack or something like that. Nobody knew what the hell was going on. All they knew is that every single radio and television and almost every computer was seeing the same thing. Some strange message in Latin, and then some strange image that we couldn't quite understand no matter how much people tried to filter it. It was coming in broken, but it was clear that somebody was speaking, although they were speaking in some sort of mechanical voice. When this message was deciphered, everybody was a little put back, mainly due to the fact that their apprehension was due to finding out that we're not alone in the universe, but also the crisis of knowing that our old lives probably just ended at that moment. Living in a small town, none of us expected that they would land here. I mean, surprises abound, right? The news organizations had already sent out their vehicles, and the military did the same when they realized where the landings were going to be, at least one of the many landings. And thankfully, the military was going to keep their vehicles and personnel out of sight as much as possible. They had to, as thousands of spacecraft spread out and landed on the planet, and we were not ready to fight a force that big. Hell, we didn't even know if we could. Each of the craft supposedly carried a group on board to gauge the population. This way, they could get an accurate representation of our entire planet and not just one little section, as in those who want to show the world and then promise everything and then pull the rug out from under you, which was a very good idea on their part, at least in theory. I told the family that I was apprehensive about the whole thing, to say the slightest, and they thought I was being paranoid. But I had to remind them that we were a patchwork society on this planet, and things could go really bad, really, really fast. They all thought I should just stop listening to those strange stories online, and I told them that maybe they should just listen more. The day our new friends landed, most of the town was there, and we watched as the ship near silently landed on the town green. As the motors spun down and the doors opened, I know for certain that I was not the only one that was finger fucking their pistol as the whole thing went down. Most men I know were armed, just in case. When the doors opened, it seemed like the typical hatch on any type of ship you see on one of those sci fi movies. As the lower portion opened and set down, a set of stairs seemed to appear, popping straight up. The inside was not a blinding light, what you would think, but the bright sunlight of that day made the internals of the ship seem rather dark. From the inside suddenly walked a human or humanoid form, yet something was wrong. The body of this thing was an odd pastel color with strange little antennae that seemed to kind of droop. One could actually mistake them for horns at a quick glance. On the hands and feet were four fingers and three toes. The ones on the feet were two toes in the front and one in the back, which was odd. It seemed to wear a very, very tight fitting bodysuit showing its form. The weird part, though, was not that its face was seemingly surprisingly human, but the fact that the body seemed gelatinous. At least it seemed that way. The body looked like it was a living jello mold as it walked slowly down towards the ground, yet it walked as though it actually had an endoskeleton. Looking at it, we were all just amazed. It lived, it survived, as there was no sign that it even had a brain in its head. We could see this because it was nearly transparent through the body. I mean, it made it clear that there was something off about this thing. We didn't know what this thing was even made out of. As the creature itself reached the grass, a few of our politicians nervously walked up towards it. I say nervously because I swear I saw one of them just about crap himself. As they did, other creatures began to exit the craft. They walked down and stood next to the gelatin thing, looking as alien as the others, yet they all had different shades and colors. Some were a light blue, not quite powder blue, but not a deep blue by any stretch of the imagination. A few were almost a lime green, but more of a deeper color than that. I don't know how else to say it. A couple were a shade of red, and one was even purple. There was no hair or anything I could see on them, and they only had rudimentary ears on either side of their head. I even wonder if that was a nose in front of their face or not. We all looked on in shock as the politicians and military officers, along with police officers, addressed these gelatinous personnel. To everyone's shock, while they spoke, smaller aliens came out. These were clearly children, and some hesitantly looked around as others ran down the ramp, just happy to be able to move outside this ship for once. As they did, one human child's curiosity got the better of it, and it went over towards the alien child. At that moment, both mothers, human and not so much, went to protect their children, grabbing them before they could reach each other. To those of us watching, they looked like mirror images of each other as they reached out and grabbed their children, each raising their hand almost the same exact way. Slowly, they let the children reach out and hold hands. Oddly enough, when the alien child did so, it seemed to glow a bit. We hoped upon hope that this meant that the child was happy and not, I don't know, angry. The gold tick must have realized that they didn't speak the language right because they handed a note to one of the politicians who handed it over to a military man who then called over to a subordinate. When the subordinate showed up, we watched as the gelatinous alien seemed to melt its hand around the subordinate's head. And when he did this, every man there clutched their pistol very, very tightly. Then the mass that was the hand retracted and became a hand again, and the alien started speaking English. We were amazed. The voice that came out seemed to be that of a teenager or 20-year-old girl. We didn't understand this at first. Why were they saying it that way? But we'd find out later. As each of them did this to one human after another, they seemed to let out the same glow as before. I worried about mind reading as they stepped up onto the trailer that we had positioned to use as a podium. They were handed a microphone, but surprisingly, they had their own PA system that they were going to use. They began to speak to us about their mission after, of course, thanking us for our hospitality and not being aggressive. They were not just emissaries, but also our version of missionaries. Their mission, of course, is to evaluate humanity and see if they can bring peace to this sector of the universe. To that end, they would like to start with their first necessity, and that is food. Speaking of this, made many of us flip the safety levers off as it continued to speak. They talked about how they consume several things that are rarely found in abundance around the galaxy, yet on this planet it's a readily available resource. As it turns out, they eat many things that we find, well, waste products or something we don't want. In particular, they consume certain bacteria that can be found on human skin or any animal skin for that matter, as long as they're mammalian. They also chew on things like viruses, of all things, and we were actually amazed at this. Along with that, they consumed several other items, but they said this wasn't much of an issue. If they couldn't get what they needed out of what they wanted, which was part of our bodies themselves, then consuming other items would be plenty. And it wouldn't be a danger to any humans, as the process was completely painless and in some cases fun. They even showed this as one of the ladies came up and they rubbed their so called hand next to her face, and after they got the makeup away, they cleaned out all of her pores and then spit the waste products down on the ground. Well, more like flicking it off like a booger. Suddenly, we were intrigued at what we were seeing. I mean, could they be serious? How was this even possible? Nobody could figure it out. Of course, there was murmurs around the crowd. And then again, I thought, we can't think of them as human, so yeah. Their representative continued by saying they need to make peace for no one to try and take advantage of them. They gave a quick synopsis of their past and revealed that another race had forced them to consume or be imprisoned. Because of the aggression, they were forced to leave their brethren behind and run, as they had very little in the way of combat prowess. This was clear just by looking at them. To this end, they will be bound to a human of their choosing, and this human will be responsible for protecting them as their partner. And in return, the Glontic will follow their lead no matter what they say. The politicians, of course, began to protest immediately as they wanted complete control over the situation, but the Glontic were very, very adamant about this. Their representative stated that this was the best way to make peace with humans. They then addressed us all and asked everyone to remain still while the Glontic chose. This whole thing made me a little nervous. Many, though, did not stay still as they backed away from this supposed selection process. A few Galantic children ran over to other children and made their choice. Of course, kids being kids, that's a universal. The parents protested, of course, mainly saying that they didn't have room or resources. I didn't have this problem. However, I didn't have time to listen to any of this conversation as the purple one was walking through the crowd and paused when it stood in front of me. That is when I realized how small these aliens actually are. I mean, this thing looking up at me could, what was it, 4.5 feet tall, maybe a little more if it was lucky, and it just kind of looked at me. I almost flinched as it reached up towards my face, and my fingers started to rub against the trigger as it went into the trigger well of my 45, waiting for anything for it to do that was stupid, so I could draw this thing and put a few rounds into it. Then, as it touched my cheek just barely, it seemed to glow and smile. Its so called hand was extremely soft to the touch. There was no fingernails or anything like that. I didn't know how to explain it except that it is the softest velvet ever, yet there was no fur. It was just smooth, like the smoothest possible skin that you could ever. It was just almost comforting. I was confused though, and I looked up to see what anyone else would say, and that's when I heard it say, "This one belongs to me." I was again seriously confused as I looked down and it reached around and hugged me. I was about to draw my pistol as it began to clear leather and shoot this thing. It spoke, saying, "Please take care of me." Realizing that it was being extremely honest. It was just as honest as any child that says something to you, that there is no malice or anything in it. I then released the grip on my pistol for the first time since they landed. And as this thing still latched onto me, I looked at others who were staring at me, and all I could say was, "Great. Now what do I do?"